Chapter 15. All three kids gasped and took a stumble backward. Clark looked at them with a smiley, panting face. The top of his head had completely split open in two, revealing not blood or brains or whatever is inside an average dog's head, but wires and blinking lights. "Clark's," said Barry breathlessly. "He's," echoed Susie. "An android?" said Petrick. "Of course he is," said Haber, who hadn't stopped working. "Didn't I mention that? Your father made him, just like he made me. He made Clark for you, Petrick, to wash over you, be your companion." Clark just sat there, alert and pleasant as could be, as someone rooted around inside his head. "But," sputtered Petrick, grasping for words, "he's so real. He's always been warm. He breathes. He eats. He even poops," Barry said, face white as fresh laundry. "Masterful, isn't it?" said Haber, still entirely focused on the inside of Clark's head. "Your father's best work, at least where recreating natural appearances is concerned." "I need to sit down," said Barry, and he did, with a thud. Susie did the same. Haber seemed to find what he was looking for, and pressed something. Clark's head reclosed itself, and suddenly he looked completely normal again. Haber lifted him into the harness, the one that was on the table, and addressed Petrick. "Now tell me, young master, these dreams you have of your father, they take place in the field, yes?" Petrick nodded. How did Haber know that? "Do you have them every night?" "I think so." "And your father, he's teaching you about all the things that separatists won't?" "Yes," Petrick nodded. "That's right." "Brilliant," Haber said in his strange, clipped accent, very pleased. "Absolutely brilliant." "What does that mean?" Susie asked. "How do you know about his dreams?" He knelt down to Petrick's eye level. "You and Clark are connected, Petrick." Sorry, let me read that again. "You and Clark are connected, Petrick. We put a memory chip right here in your head to match the one we installed into Clark. It's loaded with recordings, knowledge, and an interactive AI based on Master Fenton. We had no idea if it would work, and there was no time to test it, but it was your father's attempt to stay with you, so you wouldn't be alone." Petrick nodded. He was having trouble breathing. Haber's face grew more serious. "Now, this is important," he said, smiling. "You and Clark. You told me you were dreaming. In the middle of the dream, and Clark woke you up?" "Yes, that's right." "Was it a dream like all the others, or was it different?" Petrick physically shuddered as he thought about the feeling of the dream, the heaviness, the crushing sharpness. "It was different. It changed. I couldn't talk to my dad, and there were these hornets everywhere." Said Haber, frowning. "Is that all?" "No, he was trying to tell me something," Petrick said, "but I couldn't hear him at first. And then he pulled me in close, and he said, 'Help me.'" Petrick felt a hand on his shoulder, Susie's, and he realized that he was shaking. "Then I woke up sick. Clark was barking, and then he took off and let us hear." Haber nodded, stood, and walked back over to Clark and the harness as Petrick tried to catch his breath and slow his pounding heart. Haber punched a control on one of the panel displays. "Let's see if we can have a look," he said. A beam of light shot out from the table and spread into the circular dais at the center of the large laboratory. It interacted with several other light-emitting gadgets that appeared to ring the dais, and the picture grew. The three children walked toward it, and before them sprang up the meadow that Petrick knew so well. It was in 3 full dimensions: the grass, the blackboard, the night sky. It had color, too, though everything was tinged blue, like the light that was projecting it. "Wow," said Barry. He ran his hands along the tall grass, and they passed straight through the projection, leaving lines of light on his palms. "It's just like the Vreen outside," he said, excited. "I can see it, but it's not really there." "Ah, so you met the security system then," Haber said. "Good to know it's still active." "It's working all right," Susie said. "Nearly killed us." Uh-oh. Hopefully we're still good to go, you guys. All right. Well, if not, check it out on YouTube. It's being recorded there. I'll back up a little bit. Ah, so you met the security system then, Haber said. Good to know it's still active. It's working all right, Susie said. Nearly killed us. It is harmless, Haber said. Merely meant to scare away the vermin, though apparently not all the vermin. Haber seemed delighted with his jab. Haber, said Petrick, this isn't right. My father is always here before I am. This is just the basic template, Haber responded from the controls. I'm loading your most recent synchronizations with Clark now. As he said that, Fenton suddenly popped into view, large as life. Petrick felt his pulse quicken for a moment, as it always did whenever he saw his dad standing there. It was the oddest sensation, though, being awake and seeing him, standing there as a projected collection of light, there, but not really. In his dreams it had been one thing. He was able to write the experience off, as the intangible nature of dreams allowed you to do. Imagination, memory, something divine. But to be standing very much awake and be seeing a lifelike recreation, it was real. Susie came close, behind Petrick. He's tall, just like you said. Petrick nodded. This is Petrick's dream? Said Barry. Can we watch mine next? I can never remember them. I don't think it works like that, said Susie. Moving along, called Haber from the controls as Petrick's doppelganger bounded onto the meadow. The scene before them started to go forward in fast motion. Writing, building, laughing, running, stargazing. Haber had gone back far, indeed. Petrick found he could remember each one of these lessons with his father, building the saucer, the mishap from the other night, the medallion. He looked at Clark, who was up on the table in his little harness and watching the quickly moving light show with mild curiosity. The projection flickered slightly, and the meadow seemed to change. It was still, even though Haber was still fast-forwarding. Here, called Petrick. The scene slowed to real time. Fenton was frozen, and holographic Petrick was calling his name. A second later, the giant swarm of glow hornets rushed past as an ominous cloud of orange light. I can't hear anything, said Petrick, stepping toward the scene. Is there any way we can hear what's happening? Working on it, young master, Haber called out. The hornets flew in their angry cloud up toward the sky and then descended down directly onto Fenton, who was standing unnaturally still. They swarmed around his face in a tight ball, right as Haber managed to find the sound of the incredible recording. The noise of their multitude of wings blasted like the roar of a waterfall. The projected version of Fenton whipped his head around to face the projected Petrick, his eyes glowing a distinctly inhuman orange glow, the same glow that Petrick had seen in Clark's eyes when he had been so abruptly awakened, and his mouth began to move. But they couldn't hear him. The roar of the glowing hornets was far too loud. Okay, shouted Barry. Can we stop this now? Too scary. Can you tell what he's saying? Petrick called to Haber. I still can't hear him. Petrick looked back to see Haber frowning and working on one of the panels. The roar of the glow hornets continued, and Fenton's words were still unreachable. Hala Petrick staggered down to the ground, pleading with his father. Petrick's heart began to race as he remembered what happened next. The hornet-swarmed Fenton bent over his son, straining, pushing his face through the wild mess of light and noise. "Help me!" he shouted. The scene went dark. That's all there was. Petrick turned and ran back over to Haber. What was he saying? I still couldn't hear him. It seems, replied Haber with a dour face, this may be harder than I imagined. What do you mean? Petrick asked. Can't you just look up whatever lesson this was you programmed and take it apart? I have reason to believe we're not looking at any lesson I myself or Master Fenton programmed into Clark. Then what is it? It's a transmission, Haber said. A distress call from your father. Petrick awoke, dripping in sweat, and didn't know where he was. Clark lay between his legs, shivering. Petrick's head pounded, and he realized he was going to be sick, this time for real. He scrambled off the strange green cushion he was stretched upon, and felt his way through the unfamiliar dark room toward a crack of light that marked the slightly open door. He was dimly aware of a sleeping Barry and Susie on the floor. Outside the room, he collapsed onto his hands and knees and retched the contents of what was clearly an empty stomach. Once the painful convulsion passed, he sat and put his pounding head up against the wall. He was in the lab, he remembered. The floor was concrete and cool. He'd had the dream again, the distress call or whatever it was, just as before. It started like last night's, or was it the same night's, dream. His father frozen in the field, the rushing sound of hornets, the contracting air, the plea for help. Petrick forced himself to slow his breathing. Clark, who had followed him out of the small side room that Haber had set up for them, pawed at his master. Petrick nodded and patted the ground next to him. Clark obediently flopped down. Petrick stroked his side. Clark was still shivering. Petrick realized the dream must have had the same horrible effects on him, too. Patiently, the two waited for them to pass. Petrick remembered now how Haber had found cushions for the children to sleep on. It had taken more convincing for Barry and Susie to believe that Haber was, in fact, not evil, but they had eventually agreed it was too late to head back to Childers that night. They'd decide what to do when the morning came. Petrick wondered how long he'd been able to sleep. A clanging sound came from up toward the front of the lab. Clark perked up his ears and looked questioningly at Petrick. Haber must have been working on something. Petrick knew Clark wanted to go see what it was. So often, Petrick felt he could read the fierce little furball's mind, and vice versa. Haber had said they had an empathetic connection. Petrick wondered. "Let's go see what Haber's up to," he said. He rose to his feet unsteadily. The headache was still there, but manageable, and his legs seemed to have returned to him. They were able to walk briskly toward the clatter to find Haber at a workbench, muttering in frustration to himself and typing commands into a control panel. In the center of the dais was a holographic projection of the dream, frozen in the last moment. Fenton was stooped over a terrified holopetric, swarmed with hornets. His eyes burned orange, and the light streaks from the hornets' bioluminescent abdomens were angry wires caging in the two figures. It was striking and terrifying. The frozen holo-image flickered, caught for one more brief moment, and then clicked off. At the workbench, Haber held in some sort of verbal curse, and instead ripped out a metal rectangle from the control panel and threw it wildly out among the rows and rows of storage. It clanged loudly against something in the distance. "So that's what the noise was," Petrick said aloud. Haber whirled around, startled. Seeing the boy and Clark, he put a hand to his chest. "Kindly do not sneak up on me, young master," he said. "I don't have the disposition for such things." "Sorry," said Petrick. His gaze went over to the workbench. "What are you working on?" "The message," Haber said with a sigh. "It is uncommonly perplexing." He looked down at where he'd torn the metal rectangle from the control panel, then back at Petrick. "I woke you, didn't I?" "No," Petrick shook his head. "The dream did. I had it again." "Really?" said Haber. "Same as before?" Petrick nodded in the affirmative. "Fascinating." Petrick walked forward to the workbench and grabbed a stool to gain a view of what the android was working on. It must be on some sort of repeat. The surface of the workbench was dotted with a series of inlaid video monitors, buttons, switches, work surfaces, and other miscellaneous technologies. Petrick ran his hands over the nearest keyboard, careful not to press any keys. Haber swatted at his hands anyway. "If you don't mind, young master," he said. Petrick nodded. "What is it about this message that's so perplexing?" Haber reached for another rectangular metal device like the one he'd tossed away in frustration. He plugged it into a similarly shaped slot next to a monitor and keyed in a few commands. Behind them, Petrick heard the holoprojection of the dream click on again. I was able to download the message packet from Clark easily enough to load the beginning, Haber explained, as you can see. He gestured to the projection without looking up from what he was doing. The Hornets rushed to the scene and swarmed Fenton. Everything was orange fury, and then everything froze. Then it stops. The message ends. Haber pointed to his monitor. Petrick looked down. But there's more to it, he said, tapping the readout. I can see that plain as anything. Maybe it's coded, Petrick said. Haber's eyebrows raised. An astute suggestion, he said. I have decided the same. He tapped a switch on the small metal rectangle, and it started flashing and humming. So I plugged in a decryption module to see if I could access the rest. There was a sudden bzzz from the module, and behind them, the holoprojection of the dream flickered off, just as it had when Petrick had surprised Haber. A tiny puff of smoke rose from the burned-out module, and just like the last one, he ripped it out of its slot and tossed it away in frustration. It's burned out every time I've tried to access the rest of the message. The android clenched and unclenched his fists. I'm afraid I'm at a loss. In the silence that followed, as the two contemplated the predicament, Petrick's stomach grumbled loudly. He covered it sheepishly. Are you hungry? Haber asked with a scowl. I've been programmed with several million recipes and the skill of thousands of master chefs, and we do have a functioning food slot in the laboratory. If you require it, I suppose I could be of service. Petrick cocked his head to the side, confused by the android's grumpy offer mixed with boastful details. Sure, he answered. I mean, Clark and I could make something on our own. No, Haber shook his head and stepped back from the workbench. You'd probably break something, and that wouldn't do. Besides, an interlude would seem to be in order. To regroup, he said. He sighed and shook his head. I wish that your father were here. I'm not designed, per se, to be digging around in such things. But then, if your father were here, we really wouldn't be bothering with this silly message in the first place, would we? Petrick nodded. There must be a way, he said. He wouldn't have sent the message if he didn't want us to access it. Indeed, Haber said. The assertion seemed to cheer him. Well then, let's see to that breakfast, shall we? The android turned around and set off down one of the corridors, lined with shelves and shrouds, in a huff. Petrick could have been wrong, but he'd have sworn that Haber was enjoying himself. Chapter 16. The smell of Haber's veritable feast had drawn both Barry and Susie out of their sleep in the side room in short order. They'd stretched their cramped limbs and joined Petrick and a jubilant Clark on one end of the workbenches that Haber had set up as a de facto meal table. A feast it most certainly was. There were piles of the familiar morning fruit, potatoes, and elix that tasted as if they'd come right out of the Childers' vegetable garden, plus mounds of mysterious steaming cooked foods that none of the children had ever seen or tasted before. What's this? called Barry to Haber, who had situated himself back at his workstation, continuing to study the message. Barry held up a crispy, wavy piece of cooked meat. Colloquially, that's known as a munchin strip, Haber said. Barry cocked his head at the unfamiliar words. Haber shook his head and turned back to his workstation. It's an ancient food. Well, it's delicious, Barry replied, putting the entire crunchy strip into his face. In fact, it's all delicious. He washed it down with a long suck of fruit juice through a straw. The paper container it had come in gurgled and collapsed, empty. Barry made a gleeful "ah" sound and wiggled the carton to see if there was anything left inside. These juice boxes are amazing, he said. Have you had some, Susie? You just suck it out with one of these... He looked over at Petrick, losing the word. Straws, Petrick answered. Yeah, those. Barry nodded. Susie, did you know that juice could come in boxes? Maybe this technology stuff isn't so bad after all, huh? Susie smiled back at him, mouth full of food. I'm glad you find the meal satisfactory, said Haber. Susie pushed her plate back and patted her round belly. Petrick did the same, and they all grinned at each other. It was good to have such full bellies, which wasn't something they were so accustomed to at Childers. The food there was measured out precisely for each person. It was simply a fact of life when your entire population grew their own food. Petrick jumped off his stool and ambled over to Haber. "Any luck?" he asked. "No, and I won't have any if I keep getting interrupted." "Any idea how long it will take?" "A long time," Haber replied, giving Petrick a shooing motion. "But do you think you can do it?" "Do what?" called Barry from the breakfast table. "Find the rest of the message," Petrick answered back. Barry never missed a beat, did he? "There's more?" "Haber thinks we're only seeing a fraction of it right now, so he's figuring out how to get the rest." "To be honest, young master," Haber said, stopping what he was doing and leveling with Petrick, "I'm not sure I can decode the rest of the message. It may be beyond my abilities." "Okay," Barry said after taking a large gulp of a new juice box. "What do we need it for anyway?" "What do you mean, why do we need it?" Susie said. "Didn't you see the message last night?" "Sure," Barry said, nodding. "You mean the message that ended with Petrick's dad asking for help?" "Yes," chimed both Petrick and Susie at once. "Right," said Barry, grabbing another munchin strip and giving it a crunchy bite as he furrowed his brow. "So, he needs help. Go help him." "Barry," protested Susie, "we don't know where his dad is." "Well, he does," Barry calmly replied, pointing his strip at Haber and taking another sip of his juice. "He said last night he helped plan his trip." Susie and Petrick turned and looked at Haber, who was frowning. Crunch, they thought. Haber did say that last night. Haber was nodding, slowly. "Yes," he said, "and yes, I did help your father plan the beginning of his journey to the Outer Rim, but I have no idea where his search took him from there." "But we could start there," Petrick asked. "Try to pick his trail up." Haber sat, thinking, frowning. "Yeah," said Barry, finally finishing his food and dropping down from his stool. He wiped his hands off on his shirt. "I mean, we walked all the way here last night, didn't we? How far can this Outer Rim be? Take some snacks. We could be there before night." That was when Haber laughed. He reared back and laughed from deep within his chest. It was an entirely foreign and uncomfortable sound. It was as if something that he had not done in a very, very long time. Given the android's disposition toward gloominess and skepticism, that was likely not that far from the truth. "Children," he said, working some controls on the handheld device he'd used the night before, "I want you to take a look at something." He ushered them to the central dais, and the projectors surrounding it sprang back to life. In front of them, Haber brought up an image of a map, which they quickly recognized as containing the grounds of Childers' Home for the Parentless. "Hey!" exclaimed Susie. "That's home!" And indeed it was. Rendered in shades of transparent blue, they could see the gathering hall, the various dorms around the quad, the path that led up to their favorite corner field with the treasure shed, and the wall. Barry reached out to touch the projection, and again his hand slid through the images, leaving lines of blue burning heatlessly on his skin. Susie laughed at the giant grin he was sporting. "This is just so neat," he said, "every time." "Now, if you'll stop playing inside the projection," Haber said, "I'll show you why we're looking at your backward little home." As the three children gathered to watch, Haber turned a dial on his handheld controller, and the projection zoomed out with an exhilarating whoosh. It was like they'd suddenly flown directly up into the sky, and below them, now they could see the sprawling forest that lay beyond Childers. In one of the far corners of that sprawling forest was a tiny dot in the middle of a small open field. Haber gestured to the dot. "That is us," he said. "No way!" exclaimed Barry. He squinted one eye and traced the distance they must have traveled from Childers to the lab. "We went all that way?" "Indeed," said Haber, sounding infinitely unimpressed. "And this is the distance to the nearest Indikaran city port." The projected map zoomed out again with a giant whoosh that made the children's stomachs drop with the illusion of height and speed. The dot and the field and Childers diminished to points barely visible as an area the size of the entire forest dominated the center of the map. A new section lit up far from their dot and the lab. "Erin's Landing," he said. 400 kilometers to the southeast. "Whoa," said Barry. "That's a bit further." "But walkable, as you have suggested, Master Barry, given a few days' time," Haber said, before dialing the controller again. The projection whooshed again, but this time it didn't stop as it scaled out further and further. The city Haber had identified soon became a dot itself as the very ground of Indikar began to curve, and a red line started to rise from the diminishing point. Within seconds, they were beyond every horizon, and the full floating sphere of their planet was dwindling before them. The projection just kept going as Indikar shrank, the red line continuing to grow as they rushed past the other planets of their star system, until only the star itself was visible. Soon, even the star was a small point of light, with a red line emanating from it, and soon that red line was being joined in bunches by other red lines attached to pinpricks of light. Other star systems flew past as they zoomed outward and outward. A web of red lines crisscrossed massive dust and gas clouds as the projection rushed ever further. The very arms of their galaxy had begun to become visible when finally, mercifully, the scaling slowed to a stop. A large section of stars became highlighted, and again their tiny dot blinked at the end of their own red line in the area from which they had zoomed so far out. Haber pointed to the dot. "This, now, is us here on Indikar," he said, and then he gestured to the large expanse being highlighted. "This is the outer rim." Barry dropped the juice box that he had been holding, and then, of course, he immediately retrieved it. "That's insanity," said Susie, her mouth agape. Petrick looked for words. "Had no idea it was so big." "Space?" Haber chided. "The universe is infinite, my dear little masters. This is but our corner of it, and your father is somewhere out in that corner, slightly more than 100,000 light years in total area." "So," Barry said slowly, "you're saying that we can't walk there?" Susie socked him in the shoulder for asking such a stupid question, and Barry was so entranced by the galaxy lying before him that he didn't even protest. Petrick, however, became very interested in a small section of the map, and he walked forward and pointed to it. "Haber," he asked, "what is this?" It was a point on the map in the middle of what appeared to be a giant debris field that stretched in a thin line down virtually the entire height of the projected section they were looking at. It must have been thousands of light years long, and near its center, almost every single one of those red ribbons streaming from the stars converged into one single point, passed through the debris field, and then fanned out again in a multitude of directions on the other side, in the outer rim. "That," responded Haber, "is the wall." "The wall," Petrick repeated. He didn't think he'd ever heard of it before, in any of his dreams or otherwise. "A massive belt of planetary debris millions of years old," Haber continued. "The debris is in constant motion, and quite dense the further inside you go, which makes its center unbreachable for even the most experienced pilot in the most maneuverable craft." "Unbreachable, you say?" "Yes, except for the central gateway." "That's what this is?" Petrick said, pointing to the spot where all the red lines came together and crossed through to the other side. "These are shipping lanes, aren't they? And they all come to one point here at the wall, then go through to the outer rim on the other side." "That is correct," Haber nodded, again looking impressed. "The red lines are designated authority lines." "Authority?" Barry had his hand up in the air, like it was class. "You don't need to raise your hand," Haber said. "And yes, The Authority on Interstellar Space Travel designates corridors through space that are safe to travel, and protects them accordingly. Protects them from who? Susie was now asking the question. From whom? Haber corrected. And they protect their corridors and those who use them from dangerous natural phenomena, mechanical malfunction, pirates. Did you say pirates? Barry's eyes were wide. Haber nodded. The Authority protects the rights of its members to unrestricted, safe interstellar travel. The largest component of that, however, is their control over the supply of starstuff. Petrick turned to Haber. Haber, how did my father leave Indikar? In his ship? Haber said, not sure where the boy was going with his train of thought. Did he leave from here, the lab? Well, no, he departed from Aaron's Landing, of course, at the terminal there. Then that's where we need to go. Haber shook his head. I don't understand, young master. I've just shown you how impossibly vast an area Master Fenton traveled to. We have no idea where he went. Yes, we do, said Petrick excitedly. He went here first, didn't he? Petrick ran up to the projected map and stuck his finger right at the point where all the travel lanes funneled into one single red line. The gate! He would have had to pass through the central gateway. We can try to pick up his trail from there. Haber cocked his head to the side and considered for a moment what the boy was telling him. Wait! Exclaimed Susie. Just wait! Everyone turned to look at her. What's the big deal? Your father, the famous scientist, left you here, Petrick, and now you're just going to leave and go help him? Well, I was thinking all of us, Petrick said. Haber, too. But you're acting like it's the end of the universe. Why? Stop acting like we understand this stuff when we don't. I don't. I don't either, actually, Barry admitted, raising his hand as if they were in class. Their question hung there in the air. Petrick didn't quite know what to say, but Haber did. He pushed controls on his handheld, and the projected map shifted to show a single shining, glittering speck of light. Have you ever seen this before? Haber asked the trio. Susie and Barry stood still, but Petrick nodded. That's Starstuff, Petrick answered. Can you tell your friends what it is? Haber asked him. Petrick's told us about Starstuff, Susie said. It makes it so technologies, like ships and stuff, can travel faster than light can. And that's a big deal in space. Yes, it is. Haber nodded. The projection switched back to the wide view of the outer rim. It's what has allowed humans to spread out into the galaxy. He pointed to Indikar on the projected map. Do you know how long it would take to get from here to the wall at just slower than light speed? The children shook their heads. 2 million seasons. Longer than there have been Vreen on this planet. With a Starstuff drive, we can get there in a matter of days. He changed the map so that the stars at the end of each red ribbon were lit up in a multitude of yellow dots. There were thousands of them. This was the reach of man's vast empire for 1,000 years, Haber narrated, fueled by Starstuff. There was a time, Haber continued, when the supply of Starstuff was believed to be inexhaustible, but that was a long time ago. The projection shifted again, and the stars began to dim, their bright red connections to the other stars fading as well. I'm acting like it's the end of the universe, child, because it is. Discovery of new Starstuff mines slowed and slowed, from every few months to every few years. The lights and ribbons continued to fade out, until what is believed to be the last was found 17 years ago. Small explosions could be seen among some of the fading stars. Barry pointed to them, enraptured. Are they fighting? He asked. Haber nodded. There have been many reactions to the disappearance of Starstuff, he said. War is one. The rise of the Authority to control what's left is another. My father left to find the source, Petrick said, to discover where it comes from, so there would be enough Starstuff for everyone. Without Starstuff, it would take 1,000 years to reach Indikar's nearest neighbor. Space travel becomes impossible, and all of this ceases to function. Haber waved at a holographic empire of man. at the holographic empire of man. Civilization, as it's been known for millennia, dies. Haber shut off the projection and looked at Susie. That, young master, is why. We have to help him, said Petrick. I'm inclined to agree, Haber said, nodding. I shall begin preparations to journey to Erin's Landing immediately, and you children should prepare for yours, back to Childers. No, Petrick said, I'm coming with you. Haber stopped in his tracks. Impossible, he said. Why, you're just a child. Certainly you can't expect to just leave your home. We found you, didn't we? Petrick said. He stepped forward and tilted up his chin. His eyes were steady. I have the message. It was sent to me. Plus, you told me you weren't sure you were ever going to be able to decode it. How can you save my father without the message? Haber cocked his head, considering. It was an excellent point. From behind Petrick, Susie grabbed his attention. If he's going, then we're going. Barry's head popped up. We are? Of course we are. Susie looked at Petrick next, as if to say, right? Petrick smiled at her and nodded, then addressed Haber again. Yeah, because we stick together. Always. What about Childers? Barry asked. What about them? Susie asked. They'll be looking for us. They won't miss 2 more orphans, Petrick said. He then got a gleam in his eye. We have to save the galaxy. Isn't that something an adult should do? Barry pressed. What has an adult ever been able to do that we haven't? Susie asked. Barry sighed. She was right. He was in too. Well, how about it, Haber? Petrick asked. Will you come with us? Haber paused, seemingly forever, then nodded. Then it's settled. We go. Together. All 3 of the children looked at Haber. So, how do we get to Erin's Landing? Susie asked. Do we walk there? No, said Haber thoughtfully. I have something better in mind. And that's the end of chapter 16. Awesome, you guys. Thank you so much for viewing. I hope you enjoyed the reading today. And yeah, we will pick up same time, same place tomorrow. And yeah, man, we are gonna head out to Erin's Landing, and we're gonna go after Petrick's father and try to find out where he is and save him. So good stuff. Yeah, guys. I really hope everybody had a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much for joining me with this reading. I hope you're enjoying these. If for some reason you've watched through this or are just tuning in right now somehow, and you want to know where the earlier chapters are, on this post, I've just added a link to YouTube. So you can check out the YouTube playlist that I've created. And if you're watching on the YouTube playlist, you're already good to go. You've got everything you need. So yeah, guys, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed. I really enjoy doing this every day. And I will see you guys again tomorrow, same time, same place, and we will pick up where we left off. See you guys.